There he is, Prasad. How are you doing, sir?
Al, so good to see you. It's been a while.
So good. It has been a while. It has been a while. We're finally making this happen. I really, really appreciate you making the time.
I appreciate your patience and reaching out regularly. I'm so glad that we can talk today.
Well, for some background here and what we're going to do, Prasad and I agreed to have a fireside chat. Obviously, there's no fire between us right now, and in California here where we are, we probably shouldn't say the word fire just for the record. But Prasad and I've had the great pleasure of knowing him, I guess, upwards 15, 16 years now. And I was with the Inform Group and invited him to speak at a conference in Baltimore. Correct me if I'm wrong. And you came in and knocked everyone's socks off. And soon thereafter, you went over and joined Google and have done some amazing work there. So, what I'd like to do with you and with our viewers today is talk about the history of people analytics, where we are now, and where we're going to go. So, you up for that?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All right, let's do it. So, first off, um, I am in this place where there's so many people doing great things, and we're innovating, and there's so much data, so many tools, and it's very, very exciting times. And there's a lot of people saying, "Well, gosh, people analytics is just starting out," and you and I know that it's been around for a long time. It's just in a variety of forms, and those forms of yesteryear haven't really gone away. And we talk about research, that's been going on for 100 years in around worker dynamics and so forth. I think over the last 20, 30 years, we've done a lot in terms of data aggregation and visualization. And over the last maybe 5+ years, 10 years, done a lot around really creating products and solutions, some driven by AI, ML, to bring insights to individuals as well as leaders. So, with that framing, can you give our listeners a basis for where you came from? How did you enter this discipline? Did you come in through an IT lens, an IO psychology lens? How did you enter this field?
Yeah, well, yes, we go back a long way. We are dating ourselves. But I got into this space in 2002 when I transitioned from doing strategy consulting at McKinsey to join Capital One. And I was joining a bunch of ex-McKinsey folks who were going to be building an HR analytics team at Capital One. And that was my first introduction to it. I loved the notion of analytics, but I didn't know what to do with the HR space because I had no background in that. I studied chemical engineering before that and worked on finance and strategy in business school and so on. But what I realized in my time at Capital One, which is a very data-driven organization and continues to be so, was three things, Al, that made me feel like, wow, there is something deep and meaningful about this space. One was that the CEO, who's also the founder, had such a deep appreciation for people issues in the organization. It was like something he treated like family. And so the kind of exposure that we had to the C suite about actions that we were taking was just phenomenal. And so I felt like the work that we are doing is meaningful. This is what senior leaders want to spend their time and effort on. So that was one thing. The second thing was that there was the opportunity in those days as well to do some incredibly advanced analytics in the people space that I just wasn't aware of. And I thought it would be much more soft and squishy and so on. And so that too was a revelation for me. And of course, as you point out, in the last few years, that has only exploded even further. The kinds of analytical methods and techniques that are available to us is just mushroomed. And then the last thing that I felt was at that stage in my career, the way for me to learn and grow was to be a better people leader. And so I felt that a lot of the things that we were doing, I was certainly benefiting from it myself, and it had to pass the test of practicality, right? Like if I didn't find it useful, how could I possibly advocate that for everyone else? And so it was just that virtuous cycle of seeing that, oh yeah, this stuff is helping me, and surely other people have similar needs too. And so it is very, very practical. And so those are the things that prompted me to stay in the space. And I was at Capital One for 5 years. And then a search firm came and said, "Hey, Google wants to build this capability too." And so here I am. And 13 years later, I still continue to be, while my role at Google has grown, people analytics continues to be a key foundational part of it.
Well, yeah, speak to that if you would, because when you and I don't know your experience at Capital One intimately, of course, but I will say at that time, my experience over at Gap Inc., obviously a different industry, but large enterprise nonetheless, was such that data was kind of an afterthought. The HR strategy would come down the pipe, and then there would be initiatives and responsible people, and at the far right of the spreadsheet would be how we're going to measure it. And it was like, wait a minute, I want to be in the front of that discussion so I can actually explore how we can not only measure these strategies, but actually formulate the strategies in the first place. So when you were brought over to Google, obviously Google was starting to become Google at that time in the middle 2000s. But what excited you about the potential there at Google? What was the approach that made you go, okay, this is a place where I can do some great things, which have ensued? So what was your perspective then?
You hit the nail on the head, Al, which is there is obviously a measurement angle to everything that we do, and that doesn't go away. But how do you participate at the front end, and how do you influence decisions in the first place? And so, right from the beginning, Google was very clear that the head of people analytics was going to report into the head of HR, right? So you're at the table with the HR leadership team, because I do truly believe that it is not for lack of skill sets and problem solving, et cetera, that might hold some analytics teams back. It is truly about context and ensuring that you have a say in decision making. And so that is something that was offered to me right from the beginning. And so that is what I appreciated. In addition to that, just like the rest of the company, the people ops function, people operations is what we call human resources out here. The people ops function was also thinking about how do we make sure that science and data and analytics influence our decision making. And so for many years, one of the things that we did was we had what we called a 3/3 hiring model. A third of people that joined the people operations function had analytical or science or research-based backgrounds. Another third had more business or consulting backgrounds. And the final third would have HR experience. And so our thought was that you put all of these disciplines together, and that is what leads to us being at the cutting edge and doing what is right. You don't want to be cutting edge just for the sake of doing so, but because that will allow us to have a different approach to the problems that we are seeing at Google. And so those were the environment for people analytics to flourish was a huge contributor that enabled us to just have a whole bunch of license to be creative, license to experiment. And that, I think, is much more valuable than the projects that we were able to choose, right? Like that environment was truly setting us up for success.
Yeah, I love the words that you're using, and I certainly celebrate the approach, because when you talk about creativity, you talk about innovating, experimenting, and to be clear, when you say experimenting, you're trying new things. And I remember at that time, there was the math problem up on billboards around here in the Bay Area. And there's also the evolution to, and you want to speak to that, please do. But then there was the evolution, and I find it fascinating even today, and I think about it often, is, correct me if I'm wrong, when someone is hired now, are they hired by a committee and the hiring manager isn't the final decision maker? Is that right? Can you share a little bit about those two stories and how analytics played a part in making those decisions and maybe refining them over time?
Yeah, the hiring process continues to be committee based. It still hasn't changed. And because Google was founded by people who spent time in academia rather than anywhere else, there was a lot of academic practices from Stanford and other places that just came over on board. And the thesis on hiring was a couple of things. One, there's a whole bunch of selection research in the social sciences that shows that one of the foundational attributes that explains success is this notion of general cognitive ability. And the question is, how do you actually measure general cognitive ability? But you know that once you do, that it's been shown in a whole bunch of research to apply across all kinds of industries and around the globe. And so our own experimentation was several rounds of thinking about what is this measure of general cognitive ability? And the initial approach was around proxies like your GPA and so on, right? Because we said, well, someone else has tested out these concepts and schools and colleges are using them. So perhaps we can use that too as a proxy. And of course, once we had a few years of data around it and made thousands of hires, I'm assuming, using that kind of approach, we found that those things had absolutely no relationship to real world performance. And so then we went back to the drawing board and said, what are the kinds of things that actually do help us measure GCA, general cognitive ability? And we came up with like much more structured rubrics. How do you have the right kind of behavioral components in there? How do you ensure that people are given work samples, and the billboards and things like that were about, hey, this is the kind of problem that you're going to be solving when you're at Google. And so to show us how we can do it. And that is what led to us having a much better construct that we can now believe in, and we can see that it's explaining more of the variance. So that was one stream that explains our evolution of hiring, which was really all about the effectiveness measure. How do you ensure that the people that you're hiring are the right people? The other element of effectiveness for us was to take out bias as much as we can. And there's just a belief that we all have that if we allowed hiring managers to make hiring decisions, then everyone is going to look in the mirror and say, that's the best model of success I know. And we're going to just hire people just like ourselves, whether it is truly like ourselves or people with backgrounds like ourselves. And so the notion was, how do we ensure that we have independent decision-making bodies that are well calibrated? And that is where hiring committees come into play, where what we task the hiring committees with is, you're not trying to hire someone who is good for that role. You're trying to hire someone who is good for Google. And so that is the responsibility that we have, because we know that people keep changing roles every few years and so on. So what's the point in this hiring someone who can just do one role and maybe is a friend of the hiring manager, et cetera, right? And so that's sort of how the hiring committee concept came up, and still continues.
Well, and I'm taken aback by how few companies take that approach. And so I know this to be true because I've heard it over the years. It's like, well, Google's doing that, but Google's Google. Google is, LeBron James. Google is just an extraordinary outlier, and they have resources that others don't. However, in knowing you over the years, you are very pragmatic. You take things out of this ethereal, esoteric potential world and bring it back to, how can we actually make people's lives better? How can we make the organization function better? So, and just a little bit more color on this question is, when I first started in this work, I was thinking that, okay, we're just going to bring a bunch of evidence to leaders and other internal customers, and they're going to say, oh, okay. And then the world is going to change. And that was obviously grossly naive. So I took more of a, without knowing it, more of the aha approach, as opposed to involving stakeholders. So my pointed question to you is, if you're coaching or advising others who are getting into this work, because we're all at varied levels of evolution with the use of people data and analytics within organizations, how would you coach them to actually make fundamental, lasting change that is going to help individuals and the organization succeed? What does that process look like, whether it be what you did at Google or what you would advise given hindsight that you have right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something that we keep discovering new ways of doing so. The the pithy summary that I would have would be it is less about methodology and data and the and so on, and it's much more about that pragmatism that you were talking about, which is ensure that this is put into production. And for me, production
Mm.
means like a few things. One is the basic one is you got to change people's mindsets or behaviors. In other words, like if you show them something like that you think is necessary for them to like evolve, then they have to change their mindsets and behaviors. So that is one basic thing. But for me, putting things into production beyond that would be you've changed the people policy, or you've changed a people program or a process, right, or a product. So those four things, and showcase and demonstrate that your analytics, your research, your really well thought out stuff has somehow been embedded in one of these four things, right? And that is like the impact, because someone has got to benefit from that, and they'll benefit from a product or a policy or a program or a process. And that is what HR departments do all day long. They're trying to recreate all of those things. So how is your analytics influencing each one of those? And every one of them is an important lever, in my opinion. And depending on like
Hmm.
what we do, they're always looking for how do we embed these things. So I'll give you examples. On the process, we talked about hiring. Selection, I think, for I would say for many companies, especially in the knowledge economy, you can solve 90% of your people problems through selection. Now, the 90% is my Prasad's estimate. It's not empirically quantified, but I would say like selection is where you start. And then once you have the right people in, then of course you can like solve for a whole bunch of things after that. So there is a lot, so a lot of the research that we do, we are always looking at what are better ways to select people, what are ways to like make things more efficient and so on. And we embed that into the process. So we have some models that we are right now doing in some parts of our hiring process where we say, hey, we predict certain different outcomes for these people, but we don't have enough certainty about our predictions to override decisions, but we want the hiring committee to re-review this case, right? So this is the machine in the loop or the human in the loop kind of process interventions. The machine isn't like automatically making decisions, but it is providing a signal, an important signal to the decision makers to say, there is something going on out here, we want you to review it again, right? So that to me is like
Yeah.
embedding analytics live into process. Another example, I'll talk to you about a product, right? We've been experimenting now with, we all know that there are critical moments in employees' experiences that have a disproportionate impact on their future, right? A manager has changed, a colleague has left the organization, you receive
Mhm.
a performance rating that you did not expect or you're surprised by, right? These are like such pivotal, critical moments. So we built a product called Moment Factory, where we said we
Mm.
can identify people who are experiencing these moments. What is the intervention that we want at that moment for them? What do we want to tell their managers? What do we want to tell the individual themselves at that moment? And we're running a whole bunch of A/B tests with our communications to say what helps people in those pivotal moments. And in some cases, of course, we
Mm.
need humans to reach out to them. So that to me is like an example of analytics feeding into a product, right? Policies, like we are always thinking about how do analytics influence policies. Our leave policies recently with COVID, we saw with our data how parents, especially, are struggling with school closures and so on. Quickly put in like a policy around how they can apply for leave for 12 weeks of paid leave to take care of children.
Mm.
Programs. We have done tons of research, as you know, on people managers. And in our leadership development programs now, that research is what we use to say, hey, these are the behaviors that we want our people managers to be better at. So the programs are catered toward helping you improve on those dimensions. So every one of these things you can embed into the rest of HR, and that to me is impact.
Yeah, I love that you're focusing on that embedding and making something sustainable, scalable, and something that happens in most cases or hopefully at speed. So, can you share with our audience, if you don't mind, there is something that you wrote on an envelope or a napkin when you first joined, and then you modified that language a few years afterwards. You want to share what that was?
Yeah, when I came in, we said, what should the mission of our organization be, right? And we were deliberate about choosing the name of people analytics because at that time the organization was called HR Analytics, and at Capital One we used to call it Workforce Analytics. And we deliberately chose the name People Analytics because it wasn't just about analytics about the people, but for the people, right? And that is something that we have stayed true to for a long time. And so the initial thought was our mission should be that all people decisions are made based on data and analytics. And it was like a very hard notion of, oh, we are the technology company. We run our search engine based on algorithms. And so we should be running all of our people decisions based on data and analytics too. So it was a very hard form of thinking at that time. But a few of our initial projects showcased to me the reason that you want humans to be in the decision making process. And that is something that continues to be a key part of my beliefs in this space now. And so we changed and morphed that to say all people decisions should be informed by data and analytics, but not made by that in the sense of algorithms just running wild. And I've been thinking about that more and more, especially these days as we think about the advances of machine learning and so on, right? There are like a few reasons that I still think that for people decisions, humans need to be part of the equation. One is that machine learning and AI, and by the way, we at Google have more capability in those fields than perhaps any other organization. And so we are absolutely betting the future on that. But even when I talk to our senior most AI and ML people, they say, yeah, the people stuff, have to wait for that, right? Like we are working on other things because AI and ML is just not ready for the people stuff yet. It doesn't, I can share certainly examples of how we are using that in quite a few of our people analytics approaches. But what I mean is for key decisions like who should you hire, who should be promoted, how much should you pay people, these are such monumental decisions that you don't yet have like enough explanatory power in any of our models, because even AI ML models are still very pattern recognition type of models. They're associative models. They're not causal models, right? And I think humans have a better interpretation of causal inference than machines do. So that is one part of it. The second is that even the best models still don't explain a whole bunch of variance. And that is just because humans are not as deterministic, I would argue, right? Everyone is just like has so much agency, and we're always. For me, the primary reason that people still need to be the decision makers is not because they are better decision makers, right? It is not, we are all subject to our own biases and so on, which we can try to adjust through committee structures, using a machine output to say, hey, review these cases and things like that. But because humans have to take accountability for these decisions, that is the reason I think humans need to be part of it, right? These are such monumental decisions. You can't say a black box is like taken over and I don't care about it. You have to take accountability for it, and so therefore you need to be involved.
Yeah, you can't just wash your hands and say, "Oh, that was the machine that did that." I mean, I swear. I mean, what's coming to mind is I give you a COVID respectful hug from distance because what you just shared there, I think, was beautiful, and it needs to be heard and understood because the idea that machines are going to provide answers, we have to be comfortable. Correct me if I'm wrong. With uncertainty, we're talking about probabilities at the end of the day. We're talking about augmenting our decisions, which actually leads into a question, because what you are sharing for me is augmented intelligence versus artificial intelligence. And granted, when AI is said, it means artificial intelligence in most people's brain, and rightly so. Just accepting that. However, most of the solutions within HR, and it sounds like the ones that you apply, are really just augmenting the decision that somebody, a human being or a group, is making. Is that a fair playback?
I think for the most important decisions, yes, right. For the most important decisions, like should you hire someone and so on, they're like huge binary components. Like there's big difference between I have a job at Google versus I don't. For those, you absolutely want humans to be involved, and so it is human augmentation. There might be other decisions that are much further upstream where we might be, and they are in the people realm, where we might be much more comfortable with the algorithm helping inform the choice. So, for example, if I went into our Grow tool and said, like, hey, we have a recommendation engine that drives and says, oh, Prasad is logged in, suggest to Prasad, right? This is like the equivalent of the Netflix algo, but for learning. That I'm totally fine with, right? We don't need like a human curating that for 100,000 people and saying, did I get every one of those choices right? Right, for Prasad and for 100,000 other people. I think recommendations are totally fine. I think there might be some steps that are like, perhaps earlier in the hiring process. If we have a huge false negative problem, this is one of the areas where we are using machine learning to help us avoid false negatives. We are able to say, hey, here are all the people who have applied to us. And in the past, we hadn't continued forward with their application. But now, knowing that similar people have been hired at Google and have progressed, should we actually go back into this pool and see if we want to have some more of them be interviewed, etc. Right? Like those kinds of things we are scaling through machine learning. We would never be able to do it efficiently using humans, but we are able to do it through AI and ML. And so there are things that you can do that are much lower weight in terms of the weight of those decisions that you can fully automate.
Yeah. Yeah, as you're talking too, it's bringing to mind that the fact that we can do so much, and there's priorities that we have to set, and there are also times where, correct me if I'm wrong again, that you say no, that this is not something that's going to achieve the outcome, or even if it is, then the cost of doing that from a human perspective or business perspective is too high. So can you speak to your prioritization and how you have potentially some wickets to say, okay, this is going to be good. However, the costs are too much, and therefore we're not going to do it. Can you speak to what your decision making process is for that?
Yeah, one of the sort of the mental guideposts for me, and this is a framework borrowed from the healthcare industry where they used to call it the triple aim, right? Which is any kind of healthcare changes needed to solve for effectiveness, efficiency, and experience. And because we are in the people space, we have added a fourth element around equity. So those are the four E's that guide us. So anytime we are thinking about an intervention or a new decision, we look at how is that going to influence effectiveness, efficiency. Effectiveness is how well are we doing, are we hiring the right people, would be an effectiveness question. Efficiency would be how much effort are we putting into hiring people. Experience would be are the people who are the candidates, the managers, the interviewers, the committees, everyone who's involved in the hiring process, how good is their experience? And equity would be certainly, are we doing it in a bias-free manner? Are we taking care of all demographics appropriately and so on, right? Like, so those are like the four sort of outcome measures for us. And to your point, the challenge that we often face in the people space is you cannot maximize all four of those attributes at the same time. right? If I want an incredibly highly effective process that is high on equity, it's not going to be efficient at all. It will require like thousands of hours of determination and so on to make a decision about something. And so that doesn't work. So I think a lot of challenges that we in the people space have to be open to is to say, just like they do in the engineering discipline now, what is the tolerance level that we are building our people, programs, and processes to, right? How much of an error rate can we actually handle? Let us be very, very clear about that because we are not going to be able to design zero error systems and we shouldn't pretend that we can. And there is a cost to this. And so, and people will say like, oh, you designed this, but like, it's falling short on like this parameter. And we just have to acknowledge that. And we have to be clear about here's the rules of the game that we are designing toward. And especially the part of the question that you asked, effectiveness versus your efficiency metric gives you your ROI. And so that would be like one metric, certainly for, at Google, we don't use that too much because we do have more resources. So if we can, for example, have a much better answer on effectiveness and equity, we are willing to have low efficiency because we want those outcomes, right? But other organizations might not, might have different constraints. And so, but I would encourage everyone to just think about like those 4 E's to just say how far can we push and what are the trade-offs that we are explicitly making around those dimensions.
Yeah, I mean, I really celebrate that you have a mental model around this, and I imagine you've socialized that with your peers and others who help make that decision on whether or not to proceed. Is that correct?
That's exactly
So you're
right,
on the
and
same.
that's how we think about. Yeah, that's exactly right.
So yeah, let's say projects go through those wickets, and you're now heading to the future. I know you're constantly innovating. Last time we had lunch, if I recall, I remember you asked me, what are some of the innovations that are happening? And I don't know, that might have been 10 years ago now. And so it's the case where I know you have a penchant, not only individually, but as an organization to innovate. So given where we are now, what excites you about the road ahead?
Um, I'll share another sort of mental model that I have, Al, and then talk about like the possibilities for the future. My own
Please.
view, we have 120 analysts in the people space at Google, so we have a lot of capacity, right, to do like a lot of cool things, and we do exercise that opportunity very well. So we're not typically constrained by resourcing, but truly by what excites us about the opportunity. As I think about the value that we create across this organization, the kinds of things, there are 3 arcs of value creation for me. One arc is, are we making the HR, that is the people operations team, our own work better, right? Are we creating more value through our better process, better programs, and so on, right? Like, we talked about a few examples there. And that is like the first measure. Then the second arc, which has even bigger impact for the organization in financial value and organizational value, is simply looking at the organization outside of HR, right? Like that is where 95% of Googlers don't work in HR. They're doing the real jobs. They're business leaders are thinking about how do I meet our business objectives and so on, our product objectives. How do we create sustainable organizations? Thinking about information flows, thinking about culture, thinking about efficiency of organizations, thinking about strategies to have talent across different locations, and thinking about like the mix between hiring and growth internally, et cetera. Right? Like all of those are how you create a sustainable organization, and there's tremendous value there. So that's the second arc of value creation. And then the third arc, which goes to like why we call ourselves people analytics, is how do we enable each individual Googler to be the best they can be? Whether it's about their own skills and capabilities, whether it is about savings for retirement, whether it's about their health and wellness, right? Anything at all that is going to make you a better human, which will help you at work, certainly, but also in life. That is the third arc of value creation for me. So anything at all that fits into any of these buckets is what is fair game for us to think about as we think about the future, right?
Well,
And
yeah, if I can just jump in just real quick, I'm so glad you went back to that mental model because I think it's massively valuable. I'm sorry I interrupted you. You keep going.
so that to me is the mental model. And so within that purview, there's so much that you can do. I particularly get excited by that third space because if we can, and this has been like one of the premises of Google, which was a little scary for me when I first joined the organization. The premise was take care of the people and they will take care of the organization, right? It was just like it just felt very empowering and very much freedom initiating. And certainly there are things that we have missed and dropped the ball on because of that kind of outlook. But in general, it has created this very special organization that is serving billions of users around the world. And so I'm really glad that is the outlook that we have in this organization. So the kinds of things that excite me about where we are currently is certainly with COVID. I think many of the inherent assumptions that we had about how and where and when work gets done have all been put to question. And so there is a lot of work that we are doing around thinking about the future of work. And this to me is very exciting because we are coming at it not just from a people operations angle, but pretty much like, every day of the week, I'm in conversations with my colleagues in real estate, in the technology space to say, how do we bring like the best of all of what we do to think about the future of work? So it's very exciting, lots of cross-functional work there. So that is one area that I think is going to keep many of us busy for quite a while. A second one that also is related to, and the needs have been very much accentuated by what we are all experiencing this year in particular, but I think is a key area for all of us, especially as we are all part of knowledge organizations, is mental well-being, right? Especially even, I'd say like pretty much in every industry sector now, we are hiring people not for their physical abilities, but for their mental faculties, right? And their knowledge and skills. And on the one hand, we have to take care of people who are suffering, whether it's stress, anxiety, depression, and all of that, right? And so that is the typical psychology kinds of interventions, and we have to all be doing a good job of that. But then there's even the other extreme, which the positive psychology movement and others have been tackling, which is even for people who are doing well, given that your reason for work, and I caught like a little bit of your last conversation with Michelle, and you were exploring similar territory. How do we ensure that people are like at their best peak productive capacity for as long as possible? And last year, I spent time with a few baseball teams, Major League Baseball teams, and the sports field is much ahead of like many other places in this space, where pretty much every one of the Major League Baseball teams has a sports psychologist and staff. And they're all thinking about what are like the mental drills that people do, just like the physical drills that you do for conditioning. What is that equivalent in the knowledge economy, right? How do we each stay at the top of our mental game? Because that is what is basically helping us earn a living and contribute to our organizations and to the world around us. So these are all like so that's one topic. And the third one that I'll talk about is just like a societal question about trust. And there have been like lots of independent studies that have been done around the notion of who do people trust these days, right? Like how do they trust government, industry, the nonprofit sector? And of course, each of us can take it within our own organizations to say, what is the level of trust? Because if we have a high trust environment, then you can do all kinds of magical things. And so we are looking into that, right? We are looking into the science behind trust and thinking about how do we have like high trust environment. So those are like three areas that I think are all relevant. I think each of these will have legs to stand for many years rather than just being a project in time. But yeah, but everything that we do on a regular basis is all still fair game, and it's all continuing as well.
Yeah, and it sounds like, thank you for sharing so much, because for me, what you're describing is very humanistic,
Yeah.
but you're not, as Google, in the you're a for-profit organization, correct me if I'm wrong, and so productivity and business outcomes matter, and so but you're making a decision, correct me if I'm wrong, as a leadership team, and certainly HR and people operations rather is enabling this, that good worker well-being benefits the organization, and you're putting a stake in the ground to enable data to bring that to life on an ongoing basis. Is that a fair playback?
And that's spot on, Al. Right? By the way, productivity underlies every one of these areas that I talked about. As we are thinking about the future of work, we are saying productivity is super important, both at the individual level, but as well at the team and the organizational level. On top of that, we want to think about flexibility. On top of that, we want to think about organizational cohesion. So those are all the outcome variables that we want to optimize for as we go into the space. And so we can't lose sight of it. Of course, everyone wants to have impact, and that is what we are here for. The the thing that I'm trying to challenge is this notion of productivity comes at the cost of well-being, right? That there's like a perception that if you have high well-being, then you must be slacking off when you're like low productivity, or that if you're highly productive, it surely must not be sustainable. And I think at the
Mm-hmm.
extremes, those two things are absolutely true. But we are seeing, as we do our measures, that there's a sizable fraction of our population that has both high productivity and high well being. Those are the exemplars. How do we learn more from them about what they're doing and do more of that? Because that is good for Google and that is good for the Googler too, right? And so thinking about it as an and rather than an or is what I think is going to get us out of this.
Yeah, no, I really applaud what you're doing, and I also want to spend a bit of time as we talk about the future around just ethics and responsible use. After all, we are about people data for good. We advocate for that. We're in the process of becoming a public benefit corporation, so we want to put a stake in the ground. And granted, we're just finding the ground and finding out what stakes to put where, because this is an ever expanding field. There's legislation that's being explored. There's obviously GDPR, which put a stake in the ground last year, or is it 2 years ago now? I can't even remember, 2 years ago. And so, what are your thoughts about, given where we are now, around ethics and responsible use? I know it's top of mind for you personally, but how is that actually adhered to with you and your team?
I love that you are sponsoring and spearheading that, Al. That is such an important issue. None of us want to be big brotherish in terms of how we use all of this data that we have available to us, because that is the kind of thing that is going to destroy trust and, frankly, create an us versus them culture rather than we're all here for it, for each other. So there are like a few ways that we have tried to do this. One is certainly, of course, we abide by every single legislation out there. And so with GDPR and so on, I think we are using those principles globally to just say, like, people have clear ownership around their data. So, in general, most of our work is very clearly opt in or opt out. So we are like very clearly specifying things. And by the way, if you want your data to be deleted, do that, right? We adhere to GDPR standards on that kind of stuff. There are a couple of things that the opt-in piece is like key for many of our most sensitive kinds of things. So, for example, we started an effort to say we want to collect more demographic data about our people, completely optional, and we'll use it only for research purposes, not for individual identification. But we want to go well beyond what EEOC requires and do that, right? And we are very clear about the usage guidelines in these kinds of things. I might have shared with you in previous conversations, when we set out our employee survey that we call Google Geist soon after I joined, we were very clear about always giving people an option to take the survey anonymously rather than confidentially. Confidential meaning, of course, we would never release your data at an individual level, but we could associate it with other things that we knew about you in HR systems. Anonymous meaning we just know you're part of Google, but we don't know anything else about you other than what you like to share. In the first year, we had 25% of Googlers take the survey anonymously because they didn't know how the data would be used. And now, out of 120,000 people, it's 200 people who take it anonymously every year, right? And you got to like build to that level of trust that you're not going to use that sensitive data in ways that is going to come back and bite you. Because the moment you lost trust, why do things like surveys? You can't believe anything that was written in surveys once you lost trust. You might as well not do it. You just throw it all out. So I think that responsibility is key. And then there are things that we never have ever used in our people analytics space. Things like badging data, right? Like who's badging into which offices and so on. We just don't want to be like tracking people. Certainly, our security team has to do that only for identifying any kinds of anomalies and so on. But from a people analytics standpoint, we never touch those kinds of data, especially because there is so much more behavioral data now. I think we have high responsibility toward treating it really, really safely and securely, and people have a right to know how their data will be used. And in many cases, the last point I'll make is, in order for people to see the value of this and not be scared, there are many things that we do where we say, this data is only used by us at an aggregate level, and the only other person who sees it confidentially is you yourself. So one of the long-standing studies that we have had, which I'm excited by, is this longitudinal panel study called GDNA, which we started 8 years back. We want to run it for 100 years, Al, assuming that Google still is around. So we have 92 to go. One of the things that we do out there is we say, hey, here's like your own report. You're a participant. This is your report for you to help you be better and to help you learn more about yourself and learn more about the world around you. I think those are like the kinds of techniques that we can use to show people that value accretes to them because of their participation and giving us data, rather than being manipulated or used in some way that they wouldn't approve of.
And for them to believe it, you actually have to deliver it to them, correct? It's not just something that you just say, you actually have to show them repeatedly. And that's just one way in which you do that. Is that correct? And are there other ways that they can see, hey, this is benefiting me and other employees within the organization?
And that's yeah. So I'll give you one example of something that we found with this kind of approach. We asked people about the imposter syndrome a few years back, and we found that a third of people at Google were subject to the imposter syndrome, where they felt like, oh my God, I'm at Google and I don't know whether I belong out here, right? And we were able to show that to everyone in the company and say, you are not alone. Many people around you feel like that, and that was just like had a very calming effect on people, right? And so they get to see how we use this kind of aggregate data to make the organization better, and then they get to see their own personal results and with tips and links on this is what you can do with your own information. And so that's how we try to make sure that they understand the value that the organization is getting, but also how they individually are benefiting.
Guys, it's wonderful, and I want to just emphasize something, and I want to get your comment on it. What you're describing can be done at organizations of all sizes. It's an approach. It doesn't require you need 120 people on your people analytics team, correct?
That's absolutely right, and certainly absolutely not right. Like I think like the size of our workforce only allows us to have an expansive view of the problems that we uncover. But whatever the size of your analytics team is, right? I bet there are super important problems that your business and that your organization are facing that you can apply, right? And so it has, yeah, you can have tremendous impact in this function, and that is something that I encourage everyone to certainly use forums like this where they learn from you and from all the participants that you're able to bring in to show how they can have impact. And that's been like the most amazing thing over the last 10 years, right, Al? Like, we just see this profession, it's become a profession. And that is very, very
Yeah.
exciting. And so kudos to you and the organization that you've built to encourage that profession being something that is thriving.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're very kind. And I got one more question before we wrap. And that's this, is that what do you hope for the discipline in the years ahead? There's a lot of things that people can do. There's legislation that's on the books. What would you like to see happen, either to mitigate risk or ensure that this work is being done more broadly? So, to your point, organizations benefit and workers benefit. What do you hope to see?
I think I'm looking at some of the things that happen in other disciplines now, and this is where perhaps you and others who bring people across various industries and various regions around the world can perhaps play a role. One is that because we are building on more than 100 years of the social sciences and so on, there is no need for us to reinvent the wheel in certain things, right? We should have like a basic level of foundational knowledge that everyone can be working off of. And we should hopefully have like a certain level of foundational infrastructure around the types of data, around the types of problems, around the approaches that are well established. There should be no reason that organizations shouldn't take advantage of that. They don't need to recreate it, right? So how do we set up that kind of here's analytical approach in a box, right? That you can just apply more broadly. The second one is the ethics part that you were talking about. How do we use these new powers and the new information that we have in a responsible way for society so that we don't create societal divides amongst management versus employees and so on? That is just corrosive. How do we make sure that like this information is used for good, right? And then the third would be similar to like what is being done in machine learning, etc. I just read this paper over the weekend about fragile families. It's like on the machine learning side, they have something called a common task, right? They give a data set and they ask all these machine learning experts with different models to come in and predict, use the data for training and then predict the results for a holdout sample. And that is what they did in the social sciences this time around. And what they found was that 160 machine learning teams all tried to predict these social sciences outcomes. And every one of them pretty much had like very, very low variance that they could explain, right? Like, and so what are like examples like that where we could have perhaps, whether it's anonymized data sets and so on, so that we are continuously advancing the field. It is a challenge, I would acknowledge, right? Like, we have shared much of our work externally, certainly after embedding them well into Google, and we invite others to do so. But of course, many of these organizations see this as proprietary knowledge, and so there are challenges for us to work out of. But I would like to look at the open source community that we have in other parts of society and see if there is something similar we could do in the people analytics space too.
Okay, love it, and would love to help facilitate that. So we'll have to keep in dialogue about it and grab your ideas. So, any closing comments before we wrap? I mean, this has been fantastic, Prasad. I super appreciate it, and you got some love coming in through the chat. And there's some questions that we're not going to have time to get to today, but I so appreciate you. Closing comments.
Just I never expected that I would spend like so many years in the people space, especially around people analytics. But this is about the human condition, right? Like we're all trying to be better ourselves as individuals and go after this type of lifelong learning and growth. So after all these years, Al, I would just say I have perhaps more questions about the future than fewer than when I started. And so that is exciting and numbing in a way, right? It's exciting because it just shows there is so much more unexplored territory out here, and that we will, together try to address them. And that is what is exciting for me. And I love that we now have tens of thousands, if not more, people who are also pursuing this profession, and we'll all be better as a society for that. So thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, of course. Well, thank you. Our profession is better for your commitment to it over the years. So thank you for persisting like you have. But Prasad, thank you again. You be well, and look forward to having lunch again before too long. Hopefully, maybe next year. We'll see. So you be well.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you. Take care.